Jon Snow is one of the most important characters in A Song of Ice and Fire, and one of the most compelling parts of his story is his identity as a bastard in Westeros. Jon gets a lot of shit because his supposed dad wasn't married to his mom when he was born. Little does he know, in the show version of events, not only were they married, he's also secretly a Targaryen prince. His true origins have yet to be revealed in the books, though. Jon's parentage is important, because not knowing who his mom is leads Jon to question who he really is. He's an outcast, and though he's brought up by the Starks and treated well by most of them, it's also made clear that he isn't one of them. And because of this, Jon searches for a place where he can truly belong. This is what leads him to want to join the Night's Watch, this ancient and honorable brotherhood of men whose sole purpose is to defend the people of the kingdoms from threats that lie beyond the wall. But despite such noble intentions, Jon is often deterred from joining the Watch by the people around him. His uncle Benjen tells Jon that the wall isn't going anywhere, and that he has no idea what he'd be giving up by taking the Black. He can never have kids, never hold land and titles. He can never get married. Even Jaime Lannister tries to advise Jon on this in Season 1. At first glance, it just seems like he's antagonizing and shitting on Jon for his life choices.
Give my regards to the Night's Watch. I'm sure it will be thrilling to serve in such an elite force. And if not, it's only for life.
Which is true, but that's only because Jaime used to be Jon, a naive boy with aspirations of honor and prestige, who joined an ancient brotherhood of renowned men and knights, only to find out that it wasn't all it was made out to be, as honor meant standing by while the king you swore to protect committed atrocities left and right. But I digress. What if, in Game of Thrones, Jon's desire to have a place and to prove himself didn't lead him to join the Night's Watch? What if Jon stayed at Winterfell? Before we get into that though, if you guys like what I have to say today, feel free to drop a like, and don't forget to subscribe for more videos. Without further ado, let's get into it. So, when I tend to do my what-ifs, I often make changes to the story or characters to make things make sense, and try to stay within some realm of realism when it comes to the characters making certain decisions that change the timeline. When it comes to Jon making the choice to stay at Winterfell, I don't think that there is a grand change that needs to be made to make this possible. As I said earlier, Jon is someone who wants to be respected. He wants to have a place in the world. After years of growing up with the Starks, but not actually being one of them, and constantly being reminded of that fact, it's no wonder he wants to leave Winterfell, despite the love he does have for them. But even after leaving, Jon still has this desire to be acknowledged by his family. And this is something that is driven home even further in the books, as even after joining the Night's Watch, Jon has a moment where he fantasizes about being recognized by Ned, being named as a Stark, and even being named heir over his brother Robb. It's something that he feels guilty about afterwards, but even so, that desire for acknowledgement from his family is there, and it's there in the show too. Like when Stannis offers to make Jon a Stark, he says being a Stark is all he's ever wanted. The only thing that gets in the way of him accepting this offer, though, is his newfound sense of duty. Jon in the earlier seasons, though, would have been a very different story when it comes to that, and this is the foundation of today's if. It's not a big change or really a change at all to his character, but Jon's desire to be accepted and belong somewhere is what compels him to stay at Winterfell instead of going to the Night's Watch. In this timeline, he prioritizes his position with the Starks, and his desire to be one day accepted by them is what compels him to stay instead of leave. So, what happens as a result of Jon staying at Winterfell? For starters, obviously he never goes to the Night's Watch, and that in and of itself could be a potential issue. This means he never meets Grenn, Pip, Maester Aemon, Jeor Mormont, and he never meets his best friend, Samwell Tarly. This kinda sucks if we're being honest, because if Jon never goes to the Night's Watch, and he never meets Sam, it's not gonna be a good time for him at Castle Black. If you remember, when Samwell first arrived at the Night's Watch, he had it rough.
I yield! Please, no more!
Jon really carried him through a lot of his time there, and helped Sam grow more confident in himself. But without Jon there, he doesn't have anyone to defend him or help him out. Not even Grenn or Pip, since they only came around as people when Jon made friends with them. So Sam will probably be getting bullied regularly at the Wall since Alistair Thorne specifically had it out for him. This may change if he still becomes a steward of Maester Aemon, but that's only if he doesn't die during training from all the abuse first. If Jon doesn't go to the Night's Watch, he will also never meet Jeor Mormont, and because he never meets the Old Bear, he never gets his sword Longclaw, which is Valyrian steel and therefore capable of killing the White Walkers. You can also cut out Jon's whole plot with the Wildlings and Mance Rayder. He won't meet Ygritte or Tormund in this timeline. He won't learn the ways of the Free Folk, and as a result of Jon not being around at the Night's Watch, the threat of the others, the White Walkers and the Night King, will not be as well known. But some of this stuff about the Wildlings and White Walkers, I'll go over a bit later in the video. So, what else is going to change in Jon's story? If Jon stays at Winterfell, I think the plot of Season 1 pretty much goes the same without too many changes. Catelyn will definitely be upset with Jon for staying at Winterfell, especially with Ned now gone and Bran in a coma. I don't think Jon would have gone with Ned to King's Landing if he stayed, since he doesn't have a place at King's Landing as a bastard. Catelyn would definitely try to make the same argument about Jon not belonging at Winterfell because he's a bastard, and something I could honestly see happening. With how fragile and emotional Catelyn was during Bran's coma, I could easily see her taking her frustrations out on Jon. Not just by limiting his contact with his brother, but Jon also becomes the target of more verbal abuse from Catelyn. She even tells Jon, after constantly seeing him walk around Winterfell, that it should have been him who fell and not Bran. Catelyn becomes a bit more like her book counterpart, who is way harsher on Jon than the show version. And Catelyn actually does say this in the books when Jon is about to leave for the Night's Watch. She calls him by his name, something that she never did to him before, and says that it should have been him, not Bran, who was lying in this bed. So with Jon staying at Winterfell, I could see this leading to a much more strained and bitter relationship between him and Cat. Other than that, another thing I see that isn't too heavy of a change to the plot of Season 1 is what happens with the Cat's Paw assassin. Now, in canon, this guy was sent to kill Bran and almost kill Catelyn until Bran's direwolf Summer ripped out his throat. But I actually want to change that in this what if. I think it would be more interesting if in this timeline, instead of Summer, it was actually Jon who saves Catelyn. Assuming he isn't helping Robb put out the fire that was started as a distraction, he makes his way to the room and ends up killing the assassin. This could be a good point for future narrative purposes. It could cause internal conflict for Catelyn. On the one hand, she's still very resentful of Jon and angry with him, but on the other hand, she's inclined to feel grateful, not just for him saving her, but him also saving Bran by extension. It also causes her to question her own feelings about Jon as a person. She's treated Jon with so much disdain and coldness. He had no reason to save her life, and yet he does. He goes against the negative stigma that is built around bastards in Westeros. And this could be the start, albeit a slow one, of Catelyn possibly changing her opinion about Jon in the future, and possibly feed into the regret she secretly feels for Jon as well. But other than that, the plot pretty much goes the same, since the events of King's Landing are pretty unaffected by what happens in the north. Ned is taken prisoner, and Robb calls the Banners to war to get his father back. Jon, of course, will join the fight like he wanted to do in canon, but this time he won't be breaking any oaths to do so. He'll fight with Robb at the Whispering Woods and help him bring in Jaime. I honestly think with how close Robb and Jon were, Jon would definitely be Robb's right-hand man during the war. Continuing on, Ned will still be killed in King's Landing, and there will be a very emotional scene of Robb and Jon grieving together. They are brothers, for all they know, and therefore the two eldest sons of Eddard Stark. So instead of Catelyn comforting Robb, I think Jon and Robb comfort each other with a nice brotherly hug, swearing to get vengeance on the Lannisters. Catelyn could probably even see this as well and watch from a distance. Maybe she doesn't go to Robb this time because he has Jon around and she's still a bit uncomfortable around him, and possibly decides to grieve on her own for the time being. Robb will eventually be named king in the north, and Jon will have no issue swearing fealty to his brother as king. I honestly feel like if Jon stayed, he could be a very influential aspect in Robb's life during the War of Five Kings. One of the things I could see Jon altering in Robb's life is who he ends up marrying. In canon, Robb makes a deal with the Frey so he can cross their bridge and fight his war. The deal was that Robb would marry one of Walder Frey's daughters and she would be his queen. But this isn't really viable anymore with the addition of a woman named Talisa, Jane Westerling in the books, who caught Robb's attention. But in this timeline with Jon around, I think this will change, primarily because of the butterfly effect. Something small now could end up being a very big change later. The big change that I see happening is that instead of Robb, It's actually Jon who meets Talisa on the battlefield, and he's the one who falls in love with her. Robb meeting Talisa was pretty much just dumb luck. He just happened to be passing by while she was sawing off a man's leg to save his life. This easily could have been anyone else, and with Jon around, that anyone else just happens to be him. I honestly think this relationship could be very interesting since Talisa is from Volantis, which is in Essos, and they probably don't have the same views on bastardy or the stigma around bastards like the people of Westeros do. So seeing Jon get accustomed to a person outside of his siblings and father who actually treats him like a person would be cool to see, and probably lay the foundation of him falling in love with her because she doesn't perceive him through the same lens like most people in Westeros would. Kinda like Ygritte in a way, who she'll be taking the place of. This also adds weight to any future conversations between Cat and Talisa as well. Remember, Catelyn once told Talisa that she prayed for Jon to die as a baby, and then prayed for him to live because she felt guilty and promised to make him a Stark, a promise that she did not keep. Imagine how much heavier this conversation would be with Catelyn having had her life saved by Jon, and Talisa being in a relationship with him. Now, if Jon is the one having a romance with Talisa, this leaves Robb open for a marriage with the Freys, especially if Jon is around as well. Jon is a very honorable man and takes a lot after Ned, so if Robb did try to stray with anyone else, I imagine having Jon breathing down his neck with talk of honor, duty, and what their father would do might be enough to deter Robb from doing anything stupid like breaking his oath. Some things I do still see happening that wouldn't be changed by Jon's appearance is that Theon still gets sent to the Iron Islands and eventually betrays Robb, later taking Winterfell. And Catelyn will still release Jaime. Everything that would have happened with her, the death of Renly, meeting Brienne, and escaping, all would have happened and gone the same. I don't think Jon would have taken her place as an envoy to meet with King Renly in this timeline. Robb says the reason he wants his mother to go talk to Renly is because he trusts her the most out of all of his people. I would say that he actually trusts Jon more in this timeline, but Jon is still a bastard and would command less respect than a noble lady would. So that's why her storyline stays the same. Roose Bolton will offer to take back Winterfell for Robb with the help of Ramsay, and once again, word will reach Robb via Roose that Bran and Rickon are nowhere to be found, and neither is Theon, which is a lie since we know where Theon really is, the Dreadfort. But this is where the timeline could get genuinely interesting. With the disappearance and potential death of his two brothers, the succession of Winterfell will be put into question. Since Robb hasn't married Talisa, or anyone for that matter since the Frey marriage won't happen until much later, it's safe to assume that he has no heir, and that is really dangerous for a king fighting on the front lines of a war. So with the survival of his brothers put in question, I believe that during the War of Five Kings, Robb would actually legitimize Jon. Not only do I find this believable because of how close Robb and Jon appear to be, and how necessary it might even be at this point, it's actually something that happens in the books, with Robb effectively being the last Stark male around with the disappearance of his brothers and the uncertainty of if he got his wife Jane pregnant in the books. He talks to Catelyn about legitimizing Jon so the cause doesn't die with him should anything happen. Now, it's unclear if Robb actually does legitimize Jon as a Stark. He wrote a will in the books, and people theorize that in that will he did actually legitimize Jon, but it's never outright stated by Robb outside of being a possible way for the Northern cause to continue. But it's gonna be much clearer here. Jon Snow will become Jon Stark. Jon will finally get the recognition and respected place in the family that he always desired. In the books, Catelyn was very against the idea of having Jon legitimized, but I think this will be different with her show variation. This version of Catelyn has shown some level of remorse when it comes to how she treated Jon over the years. And the Jon of this timeline has not only been a steadfast companion and advisor to her son, but he also saved her life from the Cat's Paw assassin, as well as Bran. So I think this cat will be a bit more open to the idea of Jon being legitimized. Now, assuming Jon doesn't go back to Winterfell, the reason I say this is because at this point, Winterfell is vacant in terms of leadership, and it's a common saying that a Stark must always be there.
I don't trust a raven to carry these words.
I'll ride to King's Landing.
No, there must always be a Stark in Winterfell.
With Jon being legitimized, he's a Stark now, and it would make sense for Robb to send him back to hold it since he is his heir and his most trusted ally. But assuming that this doesn't happen, or at the very least, Jon's return to Winterfell is delayed, he will go with Robb to Riverrun. And this is important because I believe if Jon goes to Riverrun with his brother, Gregor Clegane, the mountain that rides, is going to die. Now, why do I say that? Well, if you recall, the mountain is currently tearing up the Riverlands, and in canon, Robb devised a plan to kill him that his uncle Edmure screwed up.
I wanted to draw the mountain into the west, into our country where we could surround him and kill him. I wanted him to chase us, which he would have done because he is a mad dog without a strategic thought in his head.
Though, if I'm being honest, I can't put all the blame on Edmure. While Robb is smart, he also makes a stupid decision by not telling his uncle the entire plan and yet expecting him to follow it to a T. It's Edmure's blunder, but it's also Robb's too. The reason that I say if Jon is around, the mountain dies is because, as I said earlier, Robb would trust Jon the most out of all of his people, and Jon loves Robb. He would practically do anything for him. And since they are so close, I could easily see Robb telling Jon the full plan and sending him with some men after the mountain instead of Edmure to draw him out so they can ambush him. Jon would definitely follow the plan and get the drop on the mountain. Gregor's head will end up on a spike. This would be a pretty bad blow to Tywin since the mountain is pretty much his go-to guy for everything violence related. This is also pretty big because if the mountain dies, then Oberyn lives, since he never has to fight him in a trial by combat. Other than that, I also believe that the death of the mountain could mean the loyalty of the Karstarks as well. Once again, we're going to say this is a butterfly effect because of the changes that happened. And let me explain why. When Edmure captured the mill instead of killing the mountain, he took some hostages.
We took hostages. Willem Lannister, Martin Lannister.
Willem and Martin Lannister are 14 years old.
Martin is 15, I believe.
They hold no real political importance, but because they're Lannisters and Rickard Karstark is upset over the death of his sons and the loss of Jaime, he kills them out of revenge. This causes Robb to kill him as he views it as an act of treason, which causes him to lose a portion of his army, but I also think this goes differently. Let's say in this timeline, because they knew the plan, followed the plan, lured the mountain out, and focused all their efforts on killing him, they don't take hostages from the Lannisters. Think of it as an exchange. The boys live in this timeline, and Gregor is the one who dies. And one of the boys doesn't magically get reincarnated as Tommen later on in the story. So Robb would be in a much better position, since his men are loyal, his army is intact, Rickard Karstark isn't losing faith in Robb because he married a foreigner.
I think you lost this war the day you married her.
And his deal with the Freys would still be on the table. Robb will marry Rosalind Frey in this timeline, and I don't think that there's going to be a red wedding. A few factors went into the red wedding, and pretty much all of them had to do with Robb's blunders. The loss of his leverage in Jaime, losing the Karstarks by killing their lord, spurning the Freys by breaking his oath and marrying Talisa. This opened things up for the Freys to make a deal with Tywin, but now things are different. Jaime has still been released, but Robb would have made a name for himself and been seen as more dangerous and been more respected by orchestrating the death of the Mountain, who is probably one of the most infamous and dangerous men in Westeros. This could be seen as a great loss to Tywin that compels the Freys to stay loyal, since Walder is an opportunist and prefers favorable odds. Robb also has a bigger army with the Karstarks still around, which means a bigger conflict if Walder starts something here. Jon is also the one who is married to Talisa now, and not Robb. As I said earlier, this means he can keep his oath to the Freys by marrying Rosalind and therefore staying in their good graces. I also don't believe the Boltons will be able to make a move against Jon and Robb at this point either. Despite plotting on the Starks for so long, since Robb is in a less fragile position and with the Freys not making any moves for the time being, it's unlikely that Roose will be able to see an opportunity to turn on them. During the wedding of Rosalind and Robb, I would also say it's at this point that Arya is returned to the Starks because that portion of the story might have stayed the same as well. Stannis would have attacked King's Landing in the Battle of the Blackwater, only to be rebuffed by the Tyrells and the Lannister forces, and the Hound would have still also left the city. Eventually, he would have found Arya and followed through with his plan to ransom her back to her family. In canon, they arrived just in time for the Red Wedding, but because it was the Red Wedding, the Hound couldn't exactly give her back. but that's different now. And the return of Arya cuts her arc in Essos entirely, so none of that faceless assassin stuff. And with the return of Arya, Catelyn probably realizes how stupid she was for letting Jaime go, since she'll now know that the Lannisters were lying the whole time about having Arya. After the wedding, it's at this point that Jon will be asked to hold Winterfell in Robb's absence and be asked to take Arya back home with him, since there is no place for her on the battlefield. And the Hound is going to go with them. Here's why. I'm sure when the Hound first shows up, everyone is going to be very suspicious of him. His family works for Tywin, and they would understandably presume that he is angry about them killing his brother. But if we're going to be completely honest, the only thing that Sandor would be angry about is them killing Gregor before he got the chance to do it himself. Once he gives Arya back, and it's understood that he's protected her this entire time, I wouldn't be surprised if they make a play to lure him to their side. The Hound has no love for the Lannisters, and it's not like he has anywhere else to go. The Cleganes do have land, and with Gregor dead, he is the lord of their house now. But since he deserted the king, he is a fugitive and a wanted man. So there's no real point in him going back, and the Hound doesn't really seem like much of a lord anyway. He's Tywin's enemy though, and that could pass as a friend to a Stark. So maybe they work out a deal with Sandor where he sticks around with the Starks and he works for them and feeds them information on the Lannisters as long as they pay him or something. And he goes back to Winterfell with Jon, Arya, and Talissa. A Hound among the wolves. Sounds like it could be fun. So things seem a bit better in this timeline, but there are still issues like those I mentioned earlier. Since Jon never went to the Wall, the Wildlings would likely become more of an issue. Jon was pretty key in talking to them, infiltrating them, and trying to make peace with them. But that whole arc with them will be removed now. The Wildlings were trying to get as far north as possible to escape the others, and in canon, they raided Castle Black. Since Jon isn't here to lead them, it's likely that this raid actually works, and the Night's Watch is overwhelmed at some point. They've been on the decline for a while, and in desperate need for more members. This is only made worse because the mutiny where Jeor Mormont was killed might have still happened in this timeline as well, leaving them even more understaffed. I think either Alistair Thorne, who would probably have taken command over Castle Black since Jon isn't around, or the Wildlings, which are marching, would have taken care of them though. If the Wildlings are the ones to do it, then they'll likely take information from the mutineers before they kill them, so it'll be easier to take Castle Black. So the Night's Watch will likely get wiped out. And this means Ygritte gets to live since she won't have met Jon, never would have hesitated on killing someone she loves, and wouldn't have been shot by Ollie since he wouldn't be around either. Aside from that, the White Walkers would still be a threat, and outside of the Wildlings and Mance, no one would really know about them until later, unless someone starts talking with the Wildlings and actually believes what they're saying about the others. Now, as for Daenerys, I usually think her timeline is unaffected by Westeros until many seasons later, but I think there is one change in Westeros that could change her story overseas, and that is Tyrion. Since the Tyrells have sided with the Lannisters, Joffrey is still gonna get to marry Marjorie Tyrell, and he will still be murdered by Olenna. Tyrion will be accused of the crime, have his YOLO speech, and demand a trial by combat. This is important because if Robb and Jon kill the Mountain in this timeline, who are the Lannisters gonna use? And I'm saying this with the idea that Oberyn will still fight for Tyrion in the trial by combat. Okay, post-editing Empyrean here, I kinda realized that I may have made a mistake with this next segment that I'm about to get into, but Tyrion probably wouldn't even need Oberyn because he would have Bronn in this timeline. If you remember in canon, the reason that Bronn doesn't even bother fighting the Mountain is because he is not confident that he can beat him. He thinks the Mountain is too big, and he is too fast for a man that size. He could get lucky, but one wrong move could mean the end of his life, and he doesn't want to take that risk for Tyrion. But now, since the Mountain is dead, Bronn has more incentive to fight for Tyrion. So with that being said, if we're gonna be honest, it's very unlikely that Tyrion even needs Oberyn to begin with. But for the sake of my past self, who was unaware of this at the time, please suspend your disbelief and just roll with it for the time being. And with that being said, let's get back into it. Now, in canon, the main motivation for Oberyn is that he gets the chance to kill the Mountain for what he did to his sister and her children. But just because the Mountain is dead doesn't mean his willingness to help Tyrion is. Oberyn has sympathy for Tyrion, as he saw firsthand how cruelly he was treated as a child when Tyrion was a baby, and now even as an adult. He resonates with Tyrion and his anger, the idea of being robbed of justice. Even though he doesn't get the chance to kill the Mountain, and he doesn't get justice his way, justice in a way has been done with the Starks killing Gregor. So taking that into account, perhaps he decides to extend that opportunity for justice to Tyrion, so he can get back at the people who put him here, give him the chance he didn't have to get back at the people who wronged him. And on top of all of that, he still hates the Lannisters. Oberyn still hates Tywin. He was the one who gave the Mountain the order. So I don't think it's that much of a stretch to believe that he would go the mile for Tyrion just to screw over Tywin. If Oberyn fights for Tyrion, I doubt whoever they pick will be as effective a killer as the Mountain. And in this timeline, Tyrion will be exonerated of the crime of killing Joffrey. Since he's an innocent man now, he's never imprisoned again. He's never sentenced to die by his own father, which is one of the things that pushed him over the edge and caused him to kill Tywin.
Now, enough of this nonsense.
I am your son, and you sentenced me to die. You knew I didn't poison Joffrey, but you sentenced me all the same.
All the years of denial and pain come out here, but that is different now. Tyrion probably won't kill Tywin, and he probably doesn't kill Shae either, since he won't have a reason to stop by Tywin's room while he's escaping from prison and see her in his bed. Cersei would definitely be pissed about Tyrion surviving and getting off scot-free, and she would not let this go. At this point, I believe that Jaime would warn Tyrion and still tell him that he needs to leave, even if he is innocent. This is where I say that Daenerys' timeline changes as a result of Tyrion. Tyrion fleeing to Essos in the show seems more like a last-minute thing, since he is escaping in the middle of the night with nowhere to go. But I would say that in this timeline, Tyrion would actually end up going to Dorne. Both the Martells and Tyrion hate the Lannisters, specifically Tywin. And since Oberyn has sympathy for Tyrion and they have built that positive rapport with one another, I can see him making arrangements for Tyrion to stay with his family, who may be more accepting of him. So if Tyrion goes to Dorne, Daenerys loses one of her more sensible advisors who could actually inform and teach her about Westeros. And if Barristan Selmy still dies like he did in the show, this may not be good. She may be forced to rely more on dragons than a cool head in diplomacy. Also, something else that is interesting to think on is that since Oberyn lives in this timeline, so does Princess Myrcella. Remember, in the show, she was killed by Oberyn's lover, Arya, because she was so angry that so many Martells were killed by Lannisters. Elia and her children were killed by a Lannister dog. Oberyn was killed fighting for Tyrion, a Lannister fighting against other Lannisters. And now they house a Lannister in their own home, engaged to one of their own. So she's very vindictive, especially with the death of Oberyn. But since he lives, she won't poison Myrcella to get back with the Lannisters, and now Tyrion can spend some quality time with his niece once he gets there. And I think this is where I'm going to stop the video today. This is an interesting timeline with more than a few changes that extend from a relatively small one. But either way, I hope you guys enjoyed it. Don't forget to like, subscribe, tell me your thoughts down below, and I will see you all next time.